I figured that since the new year's begun, that now is a good time to really say that SMT 6 is on its way. If you saw my last video, then you know that I have this sort of hypothetical timeline for Atlas in 2025 and 2026 of Persona X, the Soulless Army, and SMT 6 in 2025, and then next year, 2026, is going to be Persona 6 in time for the 30th anniversary. I laid out my reasons for why in last week's video, and this week I'd like to elaborate a bit on what I feel is probably going to happen with SMT6, and what it's sort of an opportunity to be, specifically the opportunity to comment on our modern, heavily globally connected world. Back when SMT5 was being made, the developers were saying that it was being made to resonate with modern audiences and comment on modern issues like unemployment, terrorism, and nuclear war. SMT has always been a series very unafraid to really tackle politics and other controversial ideas or perspectives. Not always organically, and not all of them as well as others, but a lot of SMT's identity as a game series is based around tackling concepts, but a lot of other media just won't. In fact, it's kind of become a lost art. The Animaniacs reboot is nowhere near as spiteful to society as the 90s incarnation, for instance, and a lot of its satire felt dated when it was released. And that itself is ironic because we live in a time when politics has become more culturally assimilated than ever before, for better or for worse, and yet every major attempt to really comment on the modern era and the causes and major components feels like it's flailing about, detached and ignorant about the causes, or is toothless in any actual substance. A good contrasting example, and one that I brought up in last week's video, is that Soul Hackers remains not just timeless, but a lot like one of my all-time favorite anime, Serial Experiments Lain, even more relevant in 2025 than it did back in the 90s when it was released. While Soul Hackers 2 barely registers as a blip in Atlas's catalog after less than 5 years. Digimon is another good example. I grew up in a post-9/11 world. I resonated with the portrayal of invasive authoritarian government oversight that Digimon Tamers portrayed. Compared to Digimon Ghost Game, an anime that I thoroughly enjoyed and felt was the best Digimon anime in years, and it just didn't feel as relevant because it wasn't really speaking to the youth of today, but a hypothetical future youth, and had a pretty underwhelming finale beyond. If you'd asked me if I was excited for SMT6 a year ago, I'd have said no, because I thoroughly reviled SMT5 and was left severely wanting for Soul Hackers 2. But post-Canon of Vengeance, for all of that campaign's faults, I can now bring myself to be optimistic about a potential great SMT game. But at the same time, this comes with the caveat of will SMT6 be able to feel modern in a way that other SMT games did when they were released, and what SMT5 had sort of been promised to be but ultimately never was. Again, even the Canon of Vengeance didn't deliver on this aspect, which is fine. Nocturne feels timeless, and in part that comes from the vagueness of the time period, as does Strange Journey. But I feel that more than anything else, right now we are in need of a piece of media, of modern media, that really isn't afraid to comment on our modern world. Because media like Shin Megami Tensei 1, like Soul Hackers, like Persona 4, help us to see the perspectives of those critical of our society, and keep us open-minded to a needed change, be it progress or regression, and encourages us not to only appreciate said media, but even fact-check what is being commented on so as to better understand it. And these games are able to hold up in a way because they feel like timepieces, commenting on the worlds of yesterday and allowing us to contrast them with the world of today. And we live in a very charged time politically, just rife to be dissected by people who can actually comment on our modern plights and the surreal reality of the modern era. An era where pick-your-poison politics, as I like to call the two-party system of democracy, is causing the slow, painful erosion of democracy in places like America and here in Canada. An era where the concentration of wealth amongst a few, the use of that wealth to curry political power, and contrasted with the struggles of a working class whose salaries haven't kept up with greedflation of prices, have caused some to label this as a new Gilded Age. And that is just the tip of the iceberg with what the 2020s promises to be. The Indian government assassinated a Canadian citizen in 2023. 2 assassination attempts were made on Donald Trump just last year in 2024, and close to the end of last year, a private healthcare CEO was gunned down by a private citizen which caused the internet to erupt into jubilation and for the killer, Luigi Mangione, to be compared to Robin Hood. All things that showcase that assassinations and other acts of terrorism might become a more normal part of our everyday lives, especially given the anxiety that many feel from a second Trump term, and the similar anxiety felt here in Canada by the prospect of a potential Conservative majority government led by a similarly controversial personality. And that is just on this continent. The internet is constantly enraged over the ongoing genocide in Gaza and the attempts by Israel to annex more territory, motivated by scripture to reclaim what is seen as biblically promised territory to the Jewish people. And I'm sorry to say that if you argue anything to the contrary after over a year of the constant dehumanization, atrocities, and war crimes that the state of Israel openly boasts of on social media, especially now that they are moving to resettle Gaza and are looking to expand even more into the Middle East, you are quite frankly ignorant on the topic. And no, I don't think that bringing up the Israel-Palestine conflict is unwarranted, given the context of Abrahamic mythologies playing a central role in most SMT games. All of these topics and more are relevant, and that is key because a lot of the 2000s and 2020s thus far haven't felt like they were really concerned with the modern day. Only hypothetical futures or a generalized stereotype of an early 21st century society versus the nuances of the actual decade we live in. And that's one of the things missing in a lot of video games, typically because a large amount of time is needed to develop them. Shin Megami Tensei V is not a modern setting, it is a generically modern one, not bound to a specific time period. And while that's not a problem by itself, again, Nocturne springs to mind as a sort of similar setting. Nothing about it screams early 2000s, at least not overtly. It still makes the setting less personable and less current. Persona 4 feels like it takes place in the late 2000s. It isn't just set in that time period, it genuinely feels like playing it is going back in time to 2008. SMT 1 is the same. It genuinely feels like it is about the fate of 90s Tokyo because the game is not only set in 90s Tokyo but comments on the Japan of the 90s. And there is a magic to that, lacking in a lot of other games, and it's something that I'd like to see return because setting something in modern times and really displaying that it is a period of that time ironically helps make it timeless, especially when the developers have something to say about the modern day that can resonate with audiences across the divide of generations and growing up in the circumstances that each decade offers. We didn't really have that in the 2010s. The whole decade feels like a blur, and Persona 5 only felt modern to the extent that it wasn't archaic in setting. And that's a shame because there is not only potential, but a raw need and market for that, and I think that SMT 6, and perhaps ideally Persona 6 as well, are perfect to capitalize on this. Again, we live in a time that should be remembered and criticized for what it is. The new Gilded Age where all the wars serve no other purpose than to make the rich richer and poor poorer, where genocides are allowed, permission to do so bought by foreign governments paying off America. Now granted, this doesn't need to be accomplished with just the subject matter. Looking back at the 90s era, a lot of the games felt 90s not just in the social commentary being about the current, but also in the style, presentation, and attitudes felt at the time. Soul Hackers and SMT1 have aged well because their criticisms were very warranted and rooted in the anxieties of the time. They reflected both the future and present of the 90s specifically. Persona 3 and 4 were similarly very 2000s in the same ways that Soul Hackers and Shin Megami Tensei were 90s. They had their style and the presentation that felt distinctly defined by the time period, and their approach to their subject matter was also very 2000s as well. They used the modern day to create thematic narratives that have aged remarkably well. This is something that just doesn't feel like it happens anymore. And that is a shame because when I see media really tackle subject matter in a unique way their time period provides, it makes that media feel all the more in tune with the people of the time. I mean, imagine an SMT game that says genocide is wrong and that we shouldn't live in a system where it is allowed because of a religious scripture or because the side doing the atrocity has the money to pay off the American elites. I wouldn't just feel validated in my radicalization constantly seeing the horrific displays of violence online, I'd also feel emboldened to take more action in protest. That's one of the things about stories, in that they show a perspective, potentially multiple in the case of SMT, and this can incite a lot of thought, challenging our own beliefs and forcing us to see alternate perspectives or else reaffirming something that we may already believe and are ready to fight for. V Vengeance, for all its improved writing, didn't have that, or at least not to the extent that I would have liked, and when compared to other games. It's the best in years, but still didn't really deliver on this. Partially because it had to conform its story structure to align with the canon of creation, but also because it had to be very broad and thus a bit unwieldy beyond a very standard, if fresh and nuanced, take on chaos and law and how they relate to systemic pressure upon individuals. Let's say, for instance, that SMT6 is going to be about a power enacting a genocide to bring about their end goal. That story could then be one of two things. It could be A morally ambiguous story of chaos, law, and neutrality, exploring how these ideas could lead to genocidal tendencies even if those responsible once had the best of intentions, basically standard SMT at this point. Or it could be B, use the alignment system in a way to comment on the morals that led to it to flesh out said alignment. Typically, this would mean a new chaos game, a game that touts freedom as the highest good, and the emancipation from the oppression of an Abrahamic-coded force as the achievement of, while the lawful order is seen in an unabashedly negative light, as an authoritarian force that limits freedom to consolidate power amongst a few at the cost of the lives and livelihoods of the masses. I just described the plot of SMT2, by the way, and I think the fact that that game even exists showcases the potential I am talking about. A lot of the time, rightfully so, we associate the alignment spectrum with moral ambiguity. Alignment is meant to be an abstract force of beliefs, much like the real-life political spectrum, albeit as a spectrum of freedom versus security, as opposed to hierarchy and equality. But some of the best games in the franchise have used the alignment system to give unique perspectives on issues or give a new perspective. Persona 5 comes to mind as it uses the Chaos alignment to signal an emancipation of social unrest, a revolution bubbling below the surface of Japanese society. And Persona 5 being Chaos-oriented is not the exception but the standard. Typically, the games who do this are Chaos-oriented. Chaos is the most fleshed out and nuanced of the alignment options because it is the alignment most commonly used in this matter, and because it is the alignment in opposition to God, which typically either represents either the oppressive status quo or a radical regression in the opposite direction. SMT4 is a medieval fantasy because the forces of law saw a simpler people without access to technology or information as easier to control and manipulate, as an example. And I genuinely feel that a chaos-oriented game is what we need and what would feel the most relevant in our modern times. Not just because of my own biases, as I tend to resonate more with chaos than with law or neutrality, but because classic games of chaos, like again SMT2 and Nocturne, feel the most relevant, feel the most like they represent our modern feelings, especially anger at a system. And I just don't feel that a game of neutrality or law would have the foundation to carry this examination. I'd love to be proven wrong, but for now I feel like chaos would be the way to go, given the franchise's track record with this alignment. And that's basically what I wanted to say about the upcoming SMT6, even if I may have been a bit rambly here. Do you agree or disagree? Are you more for law or balance than chaos? Is there anything that you'd like to see sort of tackled by SMT6? You can let me know down in the comment section. I know that Luigi Mangione is essentially an American folk hero at present, and that opens up the possibility for him to be immortalized as a demon in SMT. My next video will be out next week, and like this one, it's also going to be a video of me, rather than my voice over edited footage. I recently bought a used laptop that had a working webcam, which I didn't have before, so I figured that I would experiment with this sort of style for this channel. Subscribe if you liked the video and want to see more. There are some recommendations on screen right now, including last week's video, which this one is a bit of a follow-up to. And yes, I do think that SMT6 is a likely 2025 release, or at least announcement at this point in time. Team Maniacs is confirmed to be working on something big and want to release it as soon as possible. It could have been worked on to an extent simultaneously with V Vengeance, which isn't uncommon or unheard of since Soul Hackers 2 was worked alongside SMT5. And again, the reuse of models with more experience with the Unreal Engine will hasten development time, hopefully this time without sacrificing quality. That's all for now. Have a fantastic week. I will see you next video.